The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Harlan Briggs always said was the worst day of the week for bad news. He dropped it on the counter of the general store loud enough that 3 people turned to look, and then he smiled. That wide, oily smile he saved for moments when he already knew he'd won. 30 days, he said, loud enough for everyone in earshot to hear. That's all the territorial office is giving him. 30 days to prove Silver Hollow has a proper household, a wife, a family setup, or the land reverts to open claim. He picked up the letter and held it toward the window like he was reading scripture. And we all know Colton Voss hasn't looked at a woman twice in 10 years. The store went quiet. Harlan folded the letter and tucked it into his vest pocket. Such a shame, he said. All that land, all that work, gone. He wasn't sorry, not even a little. If you've ever worked for something so long, it stopped feeling like ambition and started feeling like survival. Stay with me, because this story is about what happens when the thing you built gets threatened not by weather or drought or fire, but by a piece of paper and the man who made sure it found its way to your door. This is a story about a woman nobody expected, and a man who almost missed her entirely. If this kind of story moves you, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The morning Colton Voss found out he had 30 days to save his ranch, he was already awake before the sun, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that he stood at the window of the main house for a full 10 minutes without moving, which was the longest he'd stood still in recent memory. He'd read the letter twice. Then he'd set it on the table, face down, like hiding the words might change them. It didn't. The Territorial Household and Property Stabilization Act of 1884. He'd heard talk of it in town for months, but talk out here was cheap, and the law had seemed distant, the kind of thing that applied to other men in other counties. He'd ignored it the way a man ignores a loose board on the porch. He knew it was there. He just kept walking around it and telling himself he'd get to it eventually. Well, eventually had arrived. The law required that any single-owner land claim over 500 acres demonstrate what the territory called a stabilized household, meaning a married couple, or at minimum a documented domestic arrangement, or the land would be reclassified as available for redistribution. It was a law designed, supposedly, to encourage settlement and discourage land speculation. In practice, men like Harlan Briggs had spent 6 months paying attention to which ranchers in the county were unmarried and then making sure the right letters arrived at the right time. Colton was 30 years old. He'd owned Silver Hollow since he was 22, when he bought the original 300 acres with every dollar he'd saved from 6 years of working other men's cattle. He'd expanded it twice since then, both times legally, both times with money he earned. The land was his. The work was his. The calluses, the sleepless nights, the years of eating beans from a can and wearing boots with holes in the soles so the herd could eat through a bad winter. All of it his. And now some territorial clerk, nudged along by Harlan Briggs's money and influence, was telling him he needed a wife. He picked up the letter again and read it a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less insulting. They didn't. He set it back down and went to feed the horses. By the time the sun was fully up, the hands were moving around the property. Colton had 4 of them. Deke, who was 50-something and had been on the ranch since the first year. Russ, who was 25 and worked hard but talked too much. Pete, who was quiet and good with injured animals. And Emmett, who was the youngest at 19 and still at the stage where he was trying to prove something every single day. None of them knew about the letter yet. Deke figured it out by mid-morning, because Deke figured out most things. He came to find Colton in the south pasture, where Colton was mending a section of fence that didn't really need mending, and stood there for a while without saying anything. "You're going to town," Deke said finally. It wasn't a question. "Tomorrow." 4? Colton kept working. "There's a woman at the boarding house. A few women, I think. New arrivals from back east. The church coordinator brought them out." Deke was quiet for a long moment. "You're not the church arrangement type." "No." So the territory says I need a wife. I've got 30 days. Colton drove a nail with more force than necessary. "I'm not asking for your opinion." Deke didn't offer one. He just stood there with his arms crossed and watched Colton work with the particular patience of a man who had known his employer long enough to understand when silence was the better choice. This Briggs is doing? Deke asked. Colton didn't answer. That was answer enough. The town of Mill Haven was 12 miles east, and Colton made the ride in just under 2 hours, which meant he'd pushed his horse harder than he should have. He slowed the last mile and let the animal breathe, which was one of the few times he was better to something else than he was to himself. The boarding house run by Mrs. Adele Hutchins sat at the end of the main street, 2 stories, painted white once, and now more of a weathered gray. Mrs. Hutchins herself was on the porch when he arrived, watering a row of potted plants with the focused attention of a woman who had learned to care for small things because large things tended to disappoint. She saw him coming, and her expression shifted. Not quite surprised, but close. "Mr. Voss?" "Mrs. Hutchins." He tied the horse and came up the steps. "I'm looking for... I was told you have women here, from the Eastern Placement Service." She studied him in that way women of a certain age studied men who arrived with urgent requests and uncomfortable expressions. "I have 3 young women currently staying with me, yes, all respectable, all here by their own choice. I need to speak with them." "You need to be introduced," she corrected him, with the particular firmness of a woman who had watched enough frontier arrangements go badly to have developed strong opinions about protocol. "This isn't a transaction, Mr. Voss. These are human beings." He took his hat off. "Yes, ma'am. I apologize. I'd appreciate an introduction." She put down her watering can. "Come inside." The first 2 women were exactly what the town would have called suitable, which meant they were pretty, composed, and extremely uncomfortable the moment Colton walked into the sitting room. Clara Ames was 23, from a family in Philadelphia, and sat with perfect posture and answered his questions in complete sentences that somehow contained no actual information. She smiled at everything he said, even when nothing he said was remotely funny, and he understood within 4 minutes that she was terrified of him and had decided the best defense was relentless politeness. He thanked her and moved on. The second woman, Josephine Walsh, was more direct. She told him within 2 minutes that she expected a proper bedroom with a lock, a weekly household budget she controlled, and a clear written agreement about what this arrangement would and would not include. Colton didn't disagree with any of it, but somewhere in the middle of her third requirement, she mentioned that she'd need to be near enough to town that she could return easily if things didn't work, and he understood she was already planning her exit. He thanked her too. Mrs. Hutchins had been watching from the doorway with the careful attention of a woman keeping score. "There's one more," she said, when the second woman had gone back upstairs. Her voice was different this time, quieter, not hesitant exactly, but careful. "Send her in." "She's in the kitchen." He followed Mrs. Hutchins down the hall, past a collection of framed landscapes that didn't match the walls, into a kitchen that smelled like bread that had been baking since early morning. The woman at the table wasn't baking. She was sitting with the ledger book open in front of her and a pencil behind her ear, and she was so focused on whatever she was reading that she didn't hear them come in. "Margaret," Mrs. Hutchins said. The woman looked up. She was maybe 27 or 28, with dark hair pinned back in a practical rather than decorative way, and she was large, was the word that came first. The word Colton was aware he'd been handed by a lifetime of other people's opinions about bodies and what they meant. She had a full round face, strong hands, and eyes that were doing something he hadn't expected. They were assessing him with the same careful attention he'd been directing at every situation he walked into for the last decade. She was looking at him the way he looked at horses he wasn't sure about. "This is Colton Voss," Mrs. Hutchins said. "He owns Silver Hollow Ranch." "I know who he is," the woman said. She didn't say it rudely. She said it like a statement of fact, the way she might confirm the weather. She looked at him a second longer and then looked at Mrs. Hutchins. "Does he want coffee?" "I'm fine," Colton said. "Suit yourself." She closed the ledger. "I heard you talking to the others. The walls here are thin." "Margaret," Mrs. Hutchins started. "He should know that." She said it simply. "If he's considering this, he should know I'm direct. Some men find that off-putting." Colton pulled out a chair and sat down across from her without being invited. "What were you reading?" She pushed the ledger across the table. It was Mrs. Hutchins' household accounts. "She's been undercharged for flour for 3 months, Maggie said. "Whoever runs the supply ledger at the general store is either making mistakes or assuming she won't notice. She should go back and collect the difference before the month turns over and the records change. Colton looked at the ledger. He looked at the numbers. He didn't have Maggie's eye for it, but even he could see that she'd found something. He looked back at her. "You're not from the placement service," he said. "No." She folded her hands on the table. "I came west on my own. I was staying here while I looked for work. Mrs. Hutchins was kind enough to let me help around the house in exchange for board." "What kind of work?" "Bookkeeping, record keeping, supply management." She paused. "I'm also good with logistics, and I learn physical tasks quickly, whatever people assume to the contrary." He heard the weight in that last phrase. Knew what she was referring to without being told. "Why haven't you found work?" he asked. She gave him a look that was somewhere between patient and tired. "Because I've walked into 4 offices in this town and watched the same expression cross 4 different men's faces the moment I came through the door. The job was always just filled, very recently, while I was still walking across the room." Colton was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ledger again, then at her hands, then at the pencil still behind her ear that she hadn't noticed she was still wearing. "I have 30 days to marry," he said, "or the territory takes my ranch." "I know that too," she said. "Harlan Briggs tells that story to anyone who'll listen." "He's making the rounds?" "He had coffee here this morning." She said it flatly. "He mentioned the law twice and your name 3 times and looked pleased with himself each time he did it." Something cold settled in Colton's chest. Briggs had been here, in this house, before Colton arrived. "What did he say about me?" Colton asked. "He said you were the kind of man who'd built a respectable ranch, and it was a shame it would go to someone who knew how to maintain a proper household." She picked up her pencil and tapped it against the table once. "He said it directly to me." Colton stared at her. "He meant it as an insult," she said, without any particular emotion. "He was suggesting I'd make an unsuitable wife for a man of your standing, and therefore you'd have to settle or fail." She tilted her head slightly. "He seemed to think I'd take it as a compliment that he was speaking to me at all." "Did you?" "I told him his boots were dusty for a man who claimed to spend most of his time at the land office and not the stables, and that if he was going to keep showing up at boarding houses before 8 in the morning, he might at least bring something useful." She paused. "He left shortly after." Colton sat back in his chair and looked at Margaret Whitmore for a long moment. How was a man who had built everything he owned by knowing, not hoping, not guessing, but knowing, when something had more value than people gave it credit for. He felt that same certainty now, quiet and clear, the way the sky cleared after a bad storm. "I'm not looking for a partner," he said. It was the truth, so he said it. "I need a legal arrangement, someone who can satisfy the territorial requirements and keep things running while I work the land." "I know," she said. "That's all I'm offering." "I heard you offer Clara a separate room and a monthly allowance," Maggie said. "I want the same. I also want the ability to review your ranch accounts. Not to interfere, but because I noticed you've been operating without a proper ledger system based on what Deke mentioned to Mrs. Hutchins 2 weeks ago, and that kind of thing gets expensive." Colton blinked. "Deke talked to Mrs. Hutchins?" "He buys eggs here on Fridays." She shrugged one shoulder. "He worries about you. He doesn't say it that way, but men rarely do." He sat with that for a moment. Deke, who he'd assumed knew nothing about his finances, had apparently been concerned enough to mention it to a boarding house owner on egg-buying Fridays. "You'd come to the ranch," Colton said slowly, "on a trial basis. 2 weeks to see if it's workable." "That's reasonable." "You'd have your own room, your own space." "Yes, and if it doesn't work, we end the arrangement and you have 2 weeks left to find another option," she said. "I understand the situation." He nodded slowly. He stood up and put his hat back on. "I leave tomorrow at first light," he said. "If you're coming, be at the edge of town by sunrise." He walked back down the hall and out the front door and down the porch steps, and untied his horse and rode 3 miles back toward the ranch, before it occurred to him that he hadn't told her his decision. She had. And somehow, standing in Mrs. Hutchins' kitchen, listening to a woman tell him that Harlan Briggs had been there first and left embarrassed, Colton Voss had agreed to something he hadn't entirely planned to agree to. He thought about that the rest of the way home. Not with regret, just the particular attention of a man realizing, for the first time in a long time, that the situation was no longer entirely under his control. Maggie packed that night in under 20 minutes. She didn't own much, which she had long ago stopped feeling sorry about. A small trunk. 2 practical dresses and one that was only practical if you were being generous with the definition. Books she'd carried from Pennsylvania, an accounting manual, a novel she'd read 4 times, and a small journal she'd been keeping since she was 16, a pouch of sewing needles. Boots that were better suited to eastern streets than frontier dirt, but were the best she had. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in Mrs. Hutchins' upstairs room and looked at the trunk and tried to think clearly. The sensible part of her, the part that had kept her alive and functional through a lifetime of being measured against standards she'd never asked anyone to set, ran through the logic. Colton Voss was a practical man making a practical offer. She was a practical woman in a difficult situation. The arrangement was honest. He'd said exactly what he wanted, and she'd said exactly what she needed, and they'd agreed, and no one had pretended it was something else. That was more than she'd gotten from most situations. The less sensible part of her, the part she usually tried to keep quiet, noticed that he had sat down across from her without being invited, which meant he was a man who made himself comfortable in spaces rather than waiting to be allowed into them. She noticed that when she'd pushed the ledger across the table, he'd actually looked at it, which meant he was someone who checked things before forming opinions, small things. She knew better than to attach too much to small things. She blew out the lamp and lay down in the dark, and told herself the same thing she told herself every time she stepped into something uncertain. Just see what it is before you decide what it means. Well, she was at the edge of town before sunrise. He was already there. His horse was loaded, and his expression was the particular blank neutrality of a man trying not to look like he'd been waiting. He handed her a second horse's reins without comment. She took them. They rode out of Millhaven as the first gray light came up over the eastern hills, and neither of them spoke for the first mile, which felt, somehow, like an agreement of its own. Behind them, in the general store that was just beginning to open its shutters, Harlan Briggs stood at the window with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand and watched them go. His expression, for the first time since the letter arrived, was no longer entirely satisfied. He hadn't expected that. And that fact alone, the small, quiet fact that Harlan Briggs had not expected Maggie Whitmore to be chosen, was, without either of them knowing it yet, the very first thing that Silver Hollow Ranch had to celebrate. The horses made good time, and Maggie spent most of that first ride learning the land. Not with any conscious effort. She'd always absorbed geography the way other people absorbed conversation, taking in distances and gradients and the way the terrain shifted almost without meaning to. She noted where the road dipped into dry creek beds, where the scrub thinned enough to see long distances, where a person might get turned around in bad weather. Old habit. The same part of her brain that watched men's faces in doorways and tracked the subtle shifts in a room's temperature when she entered it. Colton didn't talk much, which she'd half expected. He rode slightly ahead, not enough to be deliberate about it, just enough that she understood this was how he moved through the world, slightly ahead of everyone else, making decisions about direction without consulting anyone. She didn't take it personally, she just filed it away. Silver Hollow came into view around mid-morning, first the fence line, then the outbuildings, then the main house sitting back from a wide dirt yard with a practical absence of anything decorative. No flower boxes, no painted shutters. Nothing that said someone had thought about how it looked from the outside. It was all function, every board and post and strung wire of it, and in spite of herself she found something almost admirable in the unashamed plainness of it. Then she saw the state of the supply shed, and the admiration shifted into something more like professional concern. The door was hanging at a slight angle. One of the hinges had come partially free of the frame, and nobody had bothered to fix it, which meant either no one had noticed or no one had considered it a priority. Through the gap she could see barrels stacked unevenly, which meant if you pulled one from the bottom, and at some point you always needed the one at the bottom, the whole arrangement came down. She said nothing. She was still a guest. She was still in the 2-week trial period where the correct behavior was to observe and not immediately tell the man who employed her that he was running his supply storage wrong. She lasted approximately 6 hours. Deke was the one who met them in the yard. He was everything his Friday egg-buying conversations had suggested, weathered in the specific way that meant outdoor work, not hardship. Careful with his words in the way of a man who had learned that words, like everything else on a ranch, could be wasted if you weren't paying attention. He looked at Maggie the way a person looks at something they'd heard described and were now checking against the description. Not unkindly, just thoroughly. "Ma'am," he said. "Deke," she said. She'd heard enough about him from Mrs. Hutchins to use his name, which seemed to catch him slightly off guard. He recovered quickly. "I'll show you to the house." "Thank you." She climbed down from the horse without help, which wasn't graceful. The horse shifted at the last moment, and she came off at a slight stumble, caught herself, and kept walking as though that was exactly what she'd intended. Nobody commented. She appreciated that. The main house was better inside than outside, though not by as much as she'd hoped. It was clean in the way that bachelor spaces were clean, the dirt was managed, the obvious messes were contained, but there was a layer of accumulated neglect in the corners and the windows and the kitchen shelves that spoke to someone who cleaned because things needed doing, not because they'd ever thought about how a space felt to be in. Deke showed her the room at the end of the hall. Small, north-facing, with a window that looked out at the fence line rather than anything scenic. A bed, a chest of drawers, a washstand. "This all right?" he asked. "It's fine," she said, and meant it. She'd slept in worse. She put her trunk at the foot of the bed and unpacked in the same efficient 20 minutes she'd packed, and then she stood in the center of the room for a moment and listened to the sounds of the ranch. Boots on floorboards, the distant complaint of a door hinge, Russ's voice somewhere outside saying something she couldn't make out, but that had the cadence of someone telling a story to anyone who'd listen. Then she went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was where she expected to find the first real evidence of how things actually ran. It did not disappoint. The flour supply was stored in 2 different containers with 2 different levels, which meant someone had started a new container before the first one was finished, which meant the older flour was being buried and would go off before it was used. The shelf arrangement put the heaviest items highest, which was how Bax got hurt. There was no running inventory list anywhere that she could find, which meant purchases were made based on what someone remembered rather than what was actually needed. She found a stub of pencil and a blank page in the back of a seed catalog and started making notes. She was on the 3rd page when Colton came in. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her and then at the pages and then back at her. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Writing down what I see." She didn't look up. "Your flour arrangement is going to cost you. You've got an older bag being buried under a newer one, and it'll go rancid before you get to it." A pause. "I've been buying flour the same way for 8 years. "I know. That's why it's worth noting." She turned the page. "Your shelving is also an injury waiting to happen. Heaviest things up high means the first time someone pulls a full barrel on a tired afternoon, something goes wrong." Another pause. Longer this time. "You've been here 4 hours," he said. 3.5. She finally looked up. "I'm not criticizing. I'm making notes so I can understand the system before I say anything that might be wrong. I want to understand how you've been doing things before I suggest anything different." He leaned against the door frame with his arms crossed. "And the pages?" "I'll write them up properly once I find a ledger. Do you have ledger books?" "Somewhere." "Where somewhere?" He thought about it, which was itself informative. "Office. Maybe. Or the desk in the front room." "Could you check?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she couldn't entirely classify. It wasn't annoyance, exactly. It was more the look of a man who had run his own household entirely on his own terms. For a long time, and was now standing in his own kitchen, being asked to locate his own documents by a woman who'd arrived that morning, and was trying to decide how he felt about that. He pushed off from the doorframe and went to look. He came back with a ledger that was barely used, 15 pages in, the last entry dated 14 months ago, and set it on the table without a word. She looked at the last entry, then at the entries before it, and something in her expression shifted into focused attention. "Who kept this before?" she asked. "I did." "And before you?" "No one." He sat down across from her. "What's wrong with it?" "Nothing's wrong with it exactly." She turned back a few pages. "It's just the expense tracking stops. You were logging everything, and then it just stops right around," she checked the date, "April of last year. That's when Pete got hurt, kicked by a horse. I was doing 3 men's work for 6 weeks. She nodded. "So you stopped tracking because you didn't have time, and then when things settled down, you didn't go back to it because you'd gotten used to not doing it. Something like that. And now you don't know exactly where your money goes." He was quiet. Quiet. I'm not judging, she said in the same tone she'd used all morning, flat and factual, and not unkind. I'm trying to understand the scope of the problem. What problem? She turned the ledger towards him and pointed at a gap in the supply records. 3 months where feed purchases appeared inconsistently, where the numbers didn't track against what a herd the size of Silver Hollows should have been consuming. This problem, she said. He leaned forward and looked at the numbers. She watched his face and saw the moment he registered what she was pointing at. Not immediately, because he wasn't a numbers man, but when it landed, it landed. That's a lot of feed, he said. It is, she agreed. More than your herd size would account for, based on what Deke told me your head count was when I asked him on the way in from the stable. He looked up sharply. You asked Deke the head count? I asked him several things. She turned the ledger back toward herself. He's forthcoming, for what it's worth. He seems relieved someone's asking. Colton sat back in his chair. He had the look of a man who had just been handed information he hadn't been looking for and wasn't entirely sure he wanted. You think someone's stealing, he said. I think the numbers don't match, she said carefully. That could mean a lot of things. Bad record keeping, which clearly happened, errors in purchasing, or it could mean something else. She closed the ledger. I'd need to do a full reconciliation before I could tell you which. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, Russ was still talking to someone. Still the same story, apparently, because the cadence hadn't changed. Do the reconciliation, Colton said finally. It'll take a few days. Fine. She nodded and opened the ledger back to the first unused page. He sat across from her for another minute, watching her work, and then he got up and went back outside, because sitting still had never been a skill he'd developed, and he suspected it wasn't going to develop tonight. The other hands responded to Maggie with the variety of reactions she'd learned to expect over 28 years of walking into rooms. Russ was the easiest because he talked to everyone with the same cheerful, indiscriminate energy and didn't seem to register that she might be any different from any other new arrival. He asked her where she was from, told her 3 things about himself before she'd responded to the first, and then asked if she wanted to see the horses, which she did because the horses were honest in ways that people rarely were. Pete was quiet, but not hostile. He watched her with the same careful attention he apparently gave to everything, including fence posts and weather. He didn't offer much, but he answered what she asked directly, and she respected that. Emmett was the one who made her aware of her own patience. He was 19, trying to demonstrate his seniority over someone who had been there 4 hours by walking slightly faster than necessary and explaining things she hadn't asked about. He showed her the supply shed with the air of a man giving a tour of something impressive, and she looked at the tilting door and the unevenly stacked barrels and said nothing because she was working on her patience. We keep it organized, Emmett said, with the particular confidence of someone who has never done the organizing. I see that, she said. He explained the barrel stacking system. She listened. She asked one question. What happens if you need the barrel on the bottom? He blinked. You pull it out. And the 2 on top of it? A pause. You're careful. She nodded. Okay. She didn't say anything else about it. But 2 days later, she reorganized the entire shed while Emmett was out with the herd, putting the most accessed supplies at the front and low. And when he came back and saw it, he went quiet for a moment and then didn't mention it, which she took as progress. The first real test came on the 4th day. She'd spent the first 3 doing what she'd said she would, working through the ledger, cross-referencing receipts when she could find them, asking questions that were direct but not accusatory, building a picture from the inside out. By the 3rd evening, she had a working draft of where the discrepancies were. By the 4th morning, she had a clearer theory. But the 4th day wasn't about the ledger. The 4th day, Colton told her at breakfast that a man from a neighboring property, Dale Ackerman, who ran 500 acres to the west, was coming for a meeting about shared water rights along the creek that ran between their properties. Do you need me to be somewhere else? She asked. He looked at her across the table with something between confusion and consideration. No, why would I? Some men prefer to conduct business without... She gestured vaguely. Sit wherever you want, he said, and got up to refill his coffee. She stayed at the kitchen table with the ledger. Dale Ackerman arrived at 10 and shook Colton's hand in the yard and came inside and stopped slightly when he saw Maggie. He recovered fast, but not fast enough. Didn't know you had a... Is this Mrs. Voss? Not yet, Colton said, which was technically correct and somehow landed in the room like a statement of intent rather than a correction. Margaret Whitmore. She's managing the household books. Ackerman nodded at her. She nodded back. The men sat at the front room table, and she stayed in the kitchen, and the wall between the rooms was not thick. She wasn't trying to listen. She wasn't not trying either. The water rights conversation took about 20 minutes and seemed routine enough. Then Ackerman said something that made her put down her pencil. You hear about Briggs making another offer on the Holloway property? I heard, Colton said. His voice was flat. Man's buying up everything on the northern edge, running the same play he ran with the Millers. Gets a look at the title, finds some technical problem with the original claim, reports it to the land office. A pause. Your deed solid? My deed is clean. I know that. I'm just saying, Briggs isn't done. And now with this household business he's been stirring up in the county, seems like he's got a particular interest in certain properties. Particular interest in mine, Colton said. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Another pause. You seem like you're handling the household situation. I am. Ackerman lowered his voice, but the wall was still thin. She going to last? Out here, I mean. She seems like she's not exactly frontier built. Maggie kept her face perfectly still and looked at a spot on the kitchen wall. There was a moment of silence from the front room. She reorganized my supply shed in 2 days, Colton said, found a 14-month accounting error I didn't know I had, and told my herd supply numbers to a stranger's face more accurately than I could have. Another pause. She'll last. She heard the chair scrape as Ackerman stood up. She went back to the ledger and did not think too carefully about why that had mattered. On the 6th day, she found it. Not the whole picture, not yet, but the clearest evidence so far that the discrepancy in the feed accounts was not accidental. She'd been cross-referencing purchase records against Deke's rough memory of delivery dates, because Deke had been on the ranch long enough to remember things the paper trail had lost. And Deke, when she asked him carefully and indirectly about whether the feed deliveries had ever seemed inconsistent, had gone quiet in the way of a man who had noticed something he hadn't known how to name. There were a few times, he said, sitting at the kitchen table with a coffee he hadn't touched, when I counted the herd and the number felt low, but the feed was going out the same. When? She asked. He told her. The dates matched 3 of the largest discrepancies in the ledger. She sat with that for a while. Deke sat with his cold coffee. You didn't tell Colton? She asked. I thought I was wrong, Deke said. Man doesn't want to hear he might have a problem when he's already carrying everything else. She understood that. She understood it from both sides. I'm going to need to talk to him, she said. Deke nodded. Yeah. He picked up the coffee and finally drank it, even though it was cold. Just be careful how you say it. He's going to want to handle it himself. I know. He's not going to want to handle it himself, Deke corrected, with the complicated honesty of a man contradicting himself because the truth required it. He's going to think he does. Different thing. She looked at him for a moment. You've worked for him a long time, she said. Since the beginning. He set the cup down. He's a good man. Not an easy one, but a good one. She nodded and closed the ledger. She told Colton that evening after supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the house had the particular quiet that came after a full day of noise. He listened without interrupting, which she'd started to understand was how he absorbed information, completely still, processing everything before responding, which could be mistaken for not listening if you didn't know what you were looking at. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You're saying someone's been taking cattle, he said. I'm saying the numbers suggest cattle were removed at certain intervals, and that someone with access to both the herd and the supply records would know exactly how to make that look like normal variance. She kept her voice even. I'm not accusing anyone specific. I don't have enough for that yet. Who had access to both? She met his eyes. Everyone on the property. He went very still. Including Deke, she said because she wasn't going to soft pedal it. Though for what it's worth, Deke is the one who gave me the dates. He noticed the herd count feeling low and didn't know what to do with it. That doesn't clear him, but it's worth noting. Colton stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her the way he went to fences when he needed to do something with his hands. I should have caught this, he said. You were doing 3 men's work for 6 weeks. And then you got back to doing your own work, and you didn't have time to look backward. That's an excuse. It's a reason. They're different. She let that sit for a moment. What matters now is what you do with it. He turned around. I handle it. How? I start watching. I compare head counts myself. I see who... If someone's been doing this for over a year, she said carefully, they're careful. They'll notice if your behavior changes. She paused. Let me keep working the records. I can build a clearer picture of the pattern, the timing, the quantities, before anyone knows we're looking. He looked at her. You want to work the investigation, he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It wasn't quite not one. I want to solve it, she said, without alerting whoever it is, which means not doing anything that changes the rhythm of the ranch before we know who to look at. He crossed his arms. She could see him arguing with himself, the part that said, handle it, and the part that was, reluctantly, doing arithmetic and arriving at the same conclusion she had. 2 more days, he said finally. You keep building the picture. Then we compare notes. Agreed. He nodded once and went back to the window, and she gathered the ledger and went down the hall to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long breath. Deke was right. He was not an easy man. She thought about Harlan Briggs having coffee at Mrs. Hutchins' boarding house at 8 in the morning, talking about Colton's law problem with that wide, oily smile. She thought about the dates in the ledger and the cattle numbers, and the careful, patient timing of whoever was doing this, the way it was designed to look like nothing if you weren't looking for something. And she thought about Colton standing at the window saying, I should have caught this with the quiet devastation of a man who believed that everything on his land was his responsibility, including the failures. There were things she understood about this man that she hadn't expected to understand so quickly, that wasn't necessarily convenient. On the 8th day, Emmett did something that told her more than 8 days of observation had. She was in the supply shed, reorganizing the back wall where the least used tools were stored, when she found an invoice folded and tucked behind a loose board. It was a feed purchase, dated 16 months ago, from a supplier in the next county, not the regular supplier Colton used. The amount on the invoice was substantial. She didn't recognize the signature authorizing the purchase, but she recognized the handwriting from the supply ledger. Not Colton's, not Deke's, not a hand she'd seen in the accounts. She folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket and went back to the shelf she'd been organizing. 20 minutes later, Emmett came into the shed for a tool she'd moved to a more logical location and couldn't immediately find. He was annoyed, which was his baseline, and said something under his breath about things not being where they belonged. Top shelf on the right, she said. He found it. He was about to leave when he stopped and looked at the back wall she'd been working on. His expression did something very small and very fast that she would not have caught if she hadn't been watching for exactly that kind of thing. He looked at the board she'd pulled loose to reorganize the tools behind it. It was a fraction of a second. Then his face went back to its normal 19-year-old expressionlessness. Looks better back here, he said. Thank you, she said. He left. She waited until she heard him cross the yard and go back toward the south pasture. Then she took the invoice out of her apron pocket and looked at it again. The handwriting on the authorization line wasn't Emmett's. She'd seen his writing on the tool list Deke had him keep. But the folded crease pattern of the invoice was specific. It had been folded to fit into a coat pocket and refolded multiple times. Someone had been looking at it regularly. Someone had been keeping it close. She took it to her room, added it to the stack of notes she'd been building, and added Emmett's name to a column she hadn't wanted to start. Not an accusation, not yet. But the board he'd looked at had been loose, and the invoice had been behind it. And his face, for that fraction of a second, had told her something that the ledger hadn't quite gotten to yet. Outside, the afternoon was starting to cool, and from somewhere near the southern fence, she could hear Colton's voice giving instructions to Russ about the herd rotation. His voice carried the particular quality of a man who expected to be heard the first time and was explaining something he'd explained before. She picked up the ledger and turned to the next blank page and kept working. 2 more days. She'd promised him 2 more days. She was already fairly certain she wouldn't need all of them. She didn't need the 2nd day. By the morning of the 9th day, she had enough. Not enough to take to a judge, not yet, but enough to lay on a table in front of Colton Voss and watch his expression. Do the thing it did when something landed. That stillness, that particular quality of silence that meant he was processing rather than dismissing. She'd been up before the house stirred, which was saying something on a ranch where 4 in the morning was considered a reasonable start. She'd lit the kitchen lamp and spread her notes across the table and gone through them one more time in the order she'd present them, because she knew from experience that the way you told a thing mattered almost as much as the thing itself. The invoice from behind the loose board. The feed purchase dates that matched the herd count drops. The secondary supplier in the next county that didn't appear anywhere else in Silver Hollow's records. The authorization signature she'd traced back through 3 careful comparisons with documents she'd found in the front room desk, to a handwriting that matched neither Colton's, nor Deke's, nor Pete's, nor Russ's. It matched Emmett's older brother, which was a problem because Emmett's older brother didn't work at Silver Hollow Ranch. He worked at Harlan Briggs's operation. She sat with that connection for a long time, long enough for the lamp to burn lower and the sky outside the kitchen window to shift from black to the particular gray that came just before light. Then she heard Colton's boots on the floorboards. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw the table. He looked at the papers, then at her, then at the lamp. "How long have you been up?" he asked. "A while." He went to the stove and started the coffee without being asked, which she noted. He hadn't done that before. The previous morning she'd always had it going before he appeared. The fact that he started it now without looking to see if she'd handle it was either an oversight or a small, unconscious shift in how he moved through the kitchen. She thought it was probably the second thing. "I said 2 more days," he said, pouring water. "I know, I finished early." She turned the first page toward him. "Sit down." He sat. She walked him through it the way she'd practiced it in her head. In order, without dramatizing it, letting the numbers make the argument because numbers didn't have an agenda. The feed discrepancies, the dates, the herd counts, the invoice, the secondary supplier, the handwriting comparison. He didn't interrupt. He didn't move much. He picked up the invoice once and held it under the lamp and set it back down. When she got to the part about this handwriting, about whose it matched, he went very still. "Say that again," he said. She said it again. He pushed back from the table and stood up, not angrily, but with the abrupt, controlled movement of a man who needed to be vertical to think. "Emmett's brother," he said. "Wade Cutler. He's been on Briggs's payroll for at least 18 months. She kept her voice level. "That doesn't necessarily mean Emmett knew, but the invoice was hidden behind a board in the supply shed, and Emmett's reaction when he saw I'd been working in that section." "What reaction?" She told him about the fraction of a second look, the face that had gone neutral too quickly. Colton turned and looked out the kitchen window at the yard that was just beginning to show shape in the pre-dawn gray. "He's 19, he said. It wasn't a defense exactly. It was a fact being weighed. "I know." If his brother told him to, he stopped, started again. If Wade told him it was fine, told him it was just some business arrangement, Emmett might not have understood what he was part of. "That's possible," she said. "Also possible he understood perfectly and did it anyway." "Yeah." He came back to the table and stood over the papers for a moment. "If Briggs is behind this, and I'm not saying he's not, this is about more than cattle. It's about weakening your numbers before the land claim reassessment," she said. "If your herd is smaller than your acreage would suggest, the territory has grounds to question whether you're maintaining the land productively. Combined with the household situation, he was setting up multiple reasons to take the ranch," Colton finished. "He's been patient about it," she said. "This has been happening for over a year. He's not someone who makes quick moves." Colton sat back down and looked at the table and didn't speak for a while. Outside, the sky was lightening properly now. From the bunkhouse, she could hear the first sounds of the hands starting their morning, the particular heavy-footed quality of men waking up and resenting it. "What do I do with Emmett?" he asked. She'd thought about this. "Nothing yet. If Emmett knows we're looking, Wade knows within a day. And if Wade knows, Briggs knows, and whatever's left of the arrangement disappears before you can document it." She paused. "Let me keep watching the records. I need 2 more clear incidents, feed purchases that don't match the herd, and then you have a pattern that a land office investigator can follow." He looked at her. "You want to let it keep happening?" "For a short window, yes." He didn't like it. She could see that. He was a man built for action, for confronting problems directly, getting them in hand, resolving them with effort and force of will. Sitting and watching something happen to him didn't come naturally. "How short a window?" he asked. 2 weeks at most, likely less. He was quiet. The 30-day clock, she said. How many days left? He had to think. 22. She nodded. Then we have time. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she was starting to recognize. Not agreement exactly, but the particular face of a man choosing to trust a process he didn't design. Fine, he said. The coffee was ready. She got up and poured 2 cups without asking and put one in front of him and sat back down with hers. He looked at the cup and something in his expression shifted slightly, too quickly to fully catch. Thank you, he said. They sat with the papers between them as the ranch outside woke up, and neither of them said anything else, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. The town trip happened on the 11th day, which was not Maggie's choice. Mrs. Hutchins sent word with a passing rider that one of the other women from the boarding house had a message for Maggie, something about a letter from back east that had arrived at the house addressed to her. It was probably nothing, a courtesy forwarding from the placement service, or something administrative about her departure, but she needed to collect it. Colton said he'd take her. She said she could go with Deke on the supply run. He said he was going anyway. She understood that wasn't entirely true, but didn't argue it. They rode into Millhaven on a Thursday, which was market day, which meant the main street had more people than usual, and the usual people were more visible than usual. She felt the shift the moment they came down the main road, the way eyes moved toward them, the way conversations paused. She was accustomed to being looked at. She had spent 28 years being looked at, in the particular way that women with her body were looked at in public, which was a combination of assessment and verdict that most people didn't realize they were delivering. What was different now was being looked at next to Colton Voss. She became aware of this gradually, the way you became aware of a sound that had been present before you noticed it. The looks weren't just at her. They were at them, together, trying to make sense of the pairing. The rancher and the woman from the east. The man who ran 500 acres and the woman people had assumed he'd never choose. She kept her posture straight and her expression neutral and focused on the horse in front of her. At the general store, Colton was loading supplies with Deke when a woman named Vera Alderman, the wife of the man who ran the lumber operation, appeared at Maggie's side with the particular energy of someone who had prepared what they were going to say in advance. "You're staying out at Silver Hollow," Vera said. Not a question. "I am," Maggie said. Vera looked her over with the careful attention of a woman cataloging for later use. "That must be difficult. The heat, the distance. You're from the east, I understand." "Pennsylvania," Maggie said. "Pennsylvania." Vera said it the way people said places they considered explanatory. "Well, frontier life is quite an adjustment." A pause, perfectly timed. "I imagine Mr. Voss has been accommodating." Maggie looked at her. She knew exactly what the conversation was. She'd had this conversation in various forms, in various rooms, since she was old enough to understand what people meant when they didn't say what they meant. "He has," she said pleasantly. "He's been particularly appreciative of the accounting work." Vera blinked. That hadn't been the direction she'd expected. "The accounting?" "I've been reorganizing the ranch records," Maggie said. There were some significant discrepancies in the supply accounts from the last 14 months. That sort of thing compounds quickly if no one catches it. She smiled, which she didn't always bother with, but found useful at particular moments. "Are you comfortable in the heat? You look a little warm." Vera touched her face reflexively and said something polite and moved away. Maggie went to find her letter. What? The letter was from her aunt in Pittsburgh, which was not nothing and not important, and she tucked it into her coat pocket to read later. Mrs. Hutchins insisted on tea, which Maggie accepted because Mrs. Hutchins' kitchen was the sort of place that made refusing tea feel like refusing basic decency. They sat across the same table where Maggie had pushed the household ledger toward a rancher she hadn't yet decided anything about, and Mrs. Hutchins poured the tea and said nothing for a moment. "How is it?" she asked finally. "Fine," Maggie said. "Fine meaning fine, or fine meaning you're managing?" Maggie turned her cup in her hands. "Both, maybe." Mrs. Hutchins looked at her with the particular insight of a woman who had spent years watching people arrive in her house in difficult circumstances and leave in various directions. "He's not a soft man," she said. "No." "But he's not a bad one." "No," Maggie agreed. He's not. Mrs. Hutchins was quiet for a moment. Vera Alderman was in here on Monday asking whether you'd started making any improvements at the ranch. I told her I hadn't heard. She sipped her tea. You may want to know that Harlan Briggs has been asking similar questions. Through other people, not directly. He's been interested in whether the arrangement is working. Maggie set her cup down carefully. He wants it not to. He wants grounds to suggest it's not a genuine household, Mrs. Hutchins said. He told Martin at the land office that he had reason to believe the Voss arrangement was contractual rather than legitimate. He used that word specifically. She paused. Legitimate. Maggie looked at the table. It was one thing to know abstractly that Briggs was working against them. It was another to sit in the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon and hear that he was already at the land office, using specific language designed to preemptively discredit what she and Colton were building. What exactly did he tell the land office? She asked. That he had information suggesting the woman brought to Silver Hollow was there under a transactional arrangement, not a genuine marital one, and that the territorial law required a genuine household, not a legal technicality. Mrs. Hutchins met her eyes. He's trying to get ahead of the documentation. If he can establish that the arrangement isn't real before you can establish that it is, the clock becomes irrelevant. Maggie was quiet for a long moment. How solid is he at the land office? She asked. Martin Frey has taken 3 land assessments from Briggs in the last 2 years, Mrs. Hutchins said. You can read into that what you like. She read into it exactly what she liked, and what she liked was not comforting. She finished her tea and said goodbye to Mrs. Hutchins and walked back to the general store where Colton was finishing the loading with Deke, and she waited until Deke had taken the supply wagon ahead, and she and Colton were alone with the horses before she told him. He listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set. Frey, he said when she finished. He's never been straight. Briggs has been at this longer than just the letter, she said. He's been building the case for months. The cattle, the household law, now pre-discrediting us at the land office. It's a 3-part approach. What do we do about Frey? We make sure that when we file documentation, we file it to the territorial office directly, not through the local land office. She'd thought about this on the ride in. If Frey is compromised, anything going through him is already tainted. We need to go over his head. Colton looked at her. You know how to do that? I know the process, she said. I worked for a land records firm in Pennsylvania for 2 years. The procedure's different out here, but the principle is the same. You file to the territorial capital, you document everything, and you make sure the record is established above the level that can be influenced. He was quiet. I'm going to need access to your original deed, she said, and any correspondence from the territorial office since you acquired the land. It's in the front room desk. When we get back. He nodded. He untied his horse, and she untied hers, and they rode out of Millhaven with the afternoon light going amber behind them, and she was aware that the errand she'd come to town for, a letter from her aunt, was now the least significant thing that had happened. The front room desk was worse than she'd expected and better than she'd feared. The deed was there, clean and properly recorded, which was the most important thing. The original land purchase documents were intact. The expansion deeds from the 2 subsequent acquisitions were filed, if not particularly organized, in a wooden box that had been shoved to the back of the lowest drawer under 3 years of miscellaneous correspondence. She spread it all out on the front room table and worked through it methodically, which was how she worked through everything. Colton sat in the armchair across the room for a while, and then came and sat at the table, because apparently watching someone else work on documents that concerned his land was harder than he'd expected. Just tell me if you find something bad, he said. I'll tell you what I find, she said, which was slightly different. What she found over the course of 2 hours was mostly clean. The deeds were solid. The original purchase was properly recorded. The expansions had been done correctly. There were no obvious title vulnerabilities, which meant if Briggs was going to go after the land on a technical claim, he'd have to manufacture the problem rather than find a real one. That was useful information. Manufacturing a problem left tracks. Your records are actually cleaner than most, she said, near the end of the 2nd hour. He looked up. Meaning? Meaning Briggs can't go after your title directly. The deed is solid, the expansions were done properly, the original claim is clean. She tapped a page. If he wants the land, he has to use the household law or the productivity question. And the productivity question ties back to the cattle, which ties back to whoever's been working that angle for him. Colton leaned forward. Emmett. Emmett's brother, she corrected carefully. And possibly Emmett. We still don't know how much he knows. I want to know. I know you do. I want to ask him directly. She looked at him. If you ask him directly, you lose the advantage you have. I also stop the bleeding immediately. You stop what's visible, she said. What's invisible keeps going. Briggs doesn't need Emmett anymore once the pattern is established. He can pull him out and leave you with nothing to document. He pushed his chair back and stood up. She'd learned this was what he did when he was arguing with himself. Created vertical space to think. He's 19, he said again. He might not even know what he's been part of. Then he won't behave guilty, she said, and we can watch his behavior and know. He stood there for a moment. You're asking me to watch someone who might be stealing from me walk around my land for 2 more weeks and not say anything. I'm asking you to give yourself enough evidence to do something permanent about it, she said, instead of something immediate. The distinction landed. She could see it. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, you're very good at thinking 2 steps ahead. It's easier from the outside, she said. You've been inside this for 8 years. It's harder to see the structure when you're holding it up. He looked at her. That's what I'm useful for, she said. It came out more straightforward than she'd intended. Not a plea, not an explanation, just a fact about the specific thing she brought to the situation that he didn't already have. He sat back down. Show me the deed again, he said. She turned it toward him, and they sat at the front room table with the lamp burning low and went through it together. And she walked him through why each section was clean and what that meant for Briggs's options. And he asked questions that were specific and sometimes legal in nature, and she answered what she could and told him clearly what she didn't know. It was close to 10 when they finished. She gathered the papers into their proper order and put them back in the wooden box, which she reorganized slightly because she couldn't help it. I'll file the documentation to the territorial capital by the end of the week, she said, before Briggs can do any more damage at the local level. Okay. He stood up. Maggie. It was the first time he'd used her name without the formal Margaret, and the shift was small enough that she wasn't entirely sure she'd registered it correctly. She looked up. Thank you, he said. For today. She nodded. Get some sleep, she said, because she didn't trust herself with anything more specific. The second week at Silver Hollow was different from the first in ways that were hard to describe and easy to feel. The rhythm changed. Not drastically. The ranch ran on schedule because ranches had to, and the hands did what they always did, and the physical work of the land didn't care about interior shifts in the people doing it. But something in the texture of the days was different. Deke started bringing his coffee to the kitchen table in the mornings instead of drinking it on the porch alone, which she suspected was his way of being available without making a production of it. Pete stopped hesitating before answering her questions. Russ had apparently decided she was a good audience for his stories, which she wasn't, but she'd learned to make affirmative sounds at appropriate intervals while continuing to work, which seemed to satisfy both of them. Even Emmett had shifted, in a particular way she found more significant than the others. He'd stopped explaining things she hadn't asked about. He'd started answering questions directly. That could mean he'd relaxed, which was fine. It could also mean he was managing his presentation, which was something else entirely. She watched him the way she'd learned to watch things, without appearing to, from the corner of a task she was already doing, building a picture from the accumulated detail of many small moments. On the 14th day, she got her second clear incident. She'd been in the supply shed doing legitimate work, a proper inventory she'd been building out in sections, when she found a discrepancy between the hay records Russ maintained and the actual quantity in the east storage. The shortfall was specific. Not general deterioration, not miscounting. A clean removal, the edges of what remained too neat for anything other than an organized taking. She documented it. Date, quantities, the difference between what Russ's record said and what the shed contained. Then she sat back on her heels in the hay-smelling dimness of the shed and thought about Emmett. Because the previous Friday, Emmett had been the last person in the east storage before the count she'd just done. She knew this because she'd made it her business to know who went where on the property and when. The same way she made it her business to know everything that moved through a ledger. Not obsessively, just carefully. She thought about a 19-year-old kid who had an older brother on Briggs's payroll. She thought about the shape of how that would work. A brother who told you it was just a small thing, just moving some supply around. Nobody got hurt. The rich rancher wouldn't even notice. She thought about how easy it was to do something small for someone you trusted before you understood that small things added up. She wasn't excusing it, but she was trying to understand it because understanding it was how you figured out the whole of what had happened. She wrote everything down and went back to the house. That evening, Colton came looking for her. She was in her room reading the letter from her aunt, which turned out to be about a property dispute in Pittsburgh that had nothing to do with her, and was her aunt's way of staying in contact without admitting she was staying in contact. She folded it back up when she heard the knock. "Come in." He opened the door and leaned in the frame. Didn't come all the way into the room, which she'd noticed was something he did. Stayed at the threshold rather than entering unless invited further. "Deke just told me the East Hay count is off," he said. "I found it this afternoon." He looked at her. "You didn't come tell me." "I was going to tell you tonight, Maggie. I needed to write it up properly before I told you," she said, "so you'd have the full picture instead of a partial one that might make you react before we're ready." He was quiet. She could see the argument running through him, the part that understood the logic and the part that was standing on the outside of a theft on his own land and hated it with a specific bone-deep hatred. "I'm ready," he said. "I know," she said, "but Briggs isn't finished. We need—" "I don't care what Briggs has planned." His voice was controlled, but only just. "This is my land. That hay was my hay. And I'm standing in the doorway of your room having a conversation about waiting while someone systematically takes from me." She put the letter from her aunt on the bed and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him. "I know," she said. "I know exactly how this feels. And I know I'm asking you to do something that goes against every instinct you have." She paused. "But if you move now, Briggs wins. He'll cut Emmett loose, destroy whatever documentation he has, and you'll have a story that's impossible to prove and a 19-year-old kid who says he doesn't know anything." She let that sit. "Or you wait 2 more weeks, 10 more days, maybe less, and you have a pattern, a connection to Briggs, and a land office record that goes over Frey's head. You don't just stop the bleeding, you stop the man causing it." He stood in the doorway for a long time. 10 days, he said, "at most. And then I handle it. And then you handle it," she said, "with me." He looked at her. The "with me" seemed to land differently than she'd intended. She didn't clarify it, because clarifying it would have made it more complicated than it needed to be. "Get some sleep," he said, and pushed off from the doorframe. She listened to him walk back down the hall and heard his door close at the far end. Outside, the ranch was settling into the sounds it made at night. The horses, the wind along the fence line, the distant complaint of timber contracting in the cooling air. She turned down her lamp and sat in the dark for a while. 10 days. She had 10 days to build the kind of case that would hold. To make sure that when Colton Voss finally moved on Harlan Briggs, and she understood now with complete clarity that it wasn't a question of if, but when. He moved with everything he needed to finish it. She thought about Vera Alderman's face in the general store, about Harlan Briggs at the boarding house at 8 in the morning, talking about legitimacy to a woman he'd assumed was no one important. She thought about Colton saying she'll last to Dale Ackerman through a thin wall. Small things. She'd always known better than to attach too much to small things. She lay down and stared at the ceiling and told herself that. She believed it less than she had 2 weeks ago, which was its own kind of problem, and not one the ledger had any columns for. The 10 days didn't hold. On the 7th day after Maggie's promise, the situation moved on its own timeline, the way situations with too many moving parts eventually did. It started with a rider. She was in the kitchen working through the final reconciliation, the document she'd been building toward since the first morning with the ledger, the one that laid out the full pattern in terms a territorial investigator could follow without needing explanation, when she heard hoofbeats in the yard that weren't any of the regular hands. Different rhythm, different weight. She'd learned the horses. She looked out the window and saw a man she didn't recognize dismounting near the water trough. He was well-dressed for the frontier, which meant his boots were clean, and his coat had been bought from somewhere with better inventory than the Millhaven General Store. He had the particular self-possession of a man who was used to arriving at properties and being received. Colton came out of the barn, and they spoke in the yard. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the shape of the conversation. Colton's posture shifting from neutral to something more careful, the visitor's hands moving in the emphatic way of someone delivering information rather than making a request. She put her pencil down. 3 minutes later, Colton came through the kitchen door, and the expression on his face was the one she'd learned meant something had changed. "Who is he?" she asked. "Thomas Greer. He's a land assessor, not from the local office." He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "Territorial." She went still. "Briggs sent him?" "Greer says he received a formal complaint filed against the Silver Hollow claim." Colton put both hands flat on the table. 3 days ago, before we filed our documentation." She sat down. "Briggs moved first. By 3 days." His voice was controlled, but the effort of that was visible. "He filed a complaint alleging that the household arrangement at Silver Hollow doesn't meet the territorial standard for a genuine domestic partnership, that the land productivity numbers don't support the acreage claim, and that there is evidence of fraudulent record-keeping in the supply accounts." The last part landed like something physical. "Fraudulent record-keeping," she said. "He's flipping it." Colton looked at her. "He's saying the discrepancies I have, the ones you found, are evidence that I falsified records to inflate my herd numbers for the land claim." She sat with that for a moment. It was, she had to admit, a precise and ugly move. Take the evidence of theft and reframe it as the evidence of fraud by the victim. If you controlled the local land office and could influence how the documentation was read, it wasn't impossible to make it stick long enough to trigger a reassessment. "How long does Greer have to make his assessment?" she asked. "He wants to spend 2 days on the property, starting today." "And then?" "Then he files his report to the territorial office, which takes it out of Frey's hands entirely." "That's actually better for us," she said immediately. Colton looked at her. "If the assessment goes to the territorial office directly, Frey can't intercept it," she said. Briggs counted on Frey being the filter. "If Greer is a legitimate territorial assessor, he seems legitimate. Then Briggs may have miscalculated by pushing this to the territorial level before he finished the groundwork." She was already turning the problem. "What Greer finds in 2 days is what the territorial office uses. That means everything we have, the pattern, the invoice, the connection to Wade Cutler. It all goes into what Greer sees." "Or he's in Briggs's pocket too," Colton said. "He might be," she said, "but he came from the territorial office, not the local one. That's a longer chain of influence, harder to be certain about." She picked up her pencil. "I need to finish this document today." "Maggie, 2 or 3 hours," she said. "Let me finish it. And you need to tell Deke to do a proper head count today, with documentation, written, dated, signed by 2 people." He was already standing. "I'll do the count myself." "Good. And Colton," he stopped. "Don't tell Greer anything about what I've been working on. Let him see the ranch, let him see the books, but don't tell him about the theft investigation yet. Not until I've finished the document and we know more about whose side he's on." He held her gaze for a moment. "You think he could be compromised?" "I think we're 2 weeks into fighting a man who has been planning this for over a year," she said. "I'm not assuming anything about anyone I haven't had time to watch." He nodded once and went back outside, and she turned to the ledger and wrote faster than she'd written in years. Thomas Greer was thorough, which was either reassuring or dangerous, depending on which side of the assessment you were standing on. He spent the first afternoon walking the property with Colton, the pastures, the fence lines, the outbuildings, the herd. She watched them from the kitchen window for a while and tried to read Greer's body language the way she read everything, but he was professionally neutral in a way that made it difficult. He came to the main house before supper and asked to see the financial records. This was the moment she'd been building toward for 2 weeks, and she felt the specific calm that came when preparation met the thing it had been preparing for. She set the completed document on the table. 41 pages, organized chronologically, cross-referenced, with the original invoice attached, and the handwriting comparison documented in a separate appendix she'd put together that morning from samples she'd collected without anyone knowing she was collecting them. Greer sat down and opened the first page. Colton stood near the window. He'd told her before Greer came in that he was going to let her run this, which had surprised her more than it probably should have. She'd simply nodded and arranged the papers and said nothing about how much that had meant. Greer read in silence for a long time. "This is comprehensive," he said finally. "It covers 14 months of discrepancies," she said. "The pattern is consistent. Specific timing, specific quantities, consistent with an external removal rather than normal variance or record error. You compiled this yourself? Yes. He looked at the invoice in the appendix. This was found on the property? Behind a loose board in the supply shed. I've documented the location and the date I found it. He turned to the handwriting comparison. Read it. Looked at the samples. Wade Cutler. He said it without inflection. He works for Harlan Briggs, she said. He is also the older brother of Emmett Cutler, who has been employed at Silver Hollow for approximately 18 months. Greer looked up at that. He looked at Colton. You know this? I know it now, Colton said. I didn't when I hired him. Greer was quiet for a moment. Mr. Briggs's complaint alleges falsified productivity records. I'm aware of what Mr. Briggs alleged, Maggie said. What that document shows is that the productivity records were accurate until someone began systematically removing livestock and supply in a pattern designed to look like natural variance. The removal is the source of the discrepancy, not falsification by Mr. Voss. Greer closed the document. This will take more than 2 days. Then take more than 2 days, Colton said. Greer looked at him. Something in the assessor's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. Mr. Voss, I'm going to need to speak with your hand. Emmett Cutler. I'll get him, Colton said. She put her hand on the document. Mr. Greer, I need to ask you directly. Are you here because Briggs sent you, or because the territorial office sent you? The room went quiet. Greer looked at her for a long moment. He was 50 or close to it, with the particular stillness of a man who had learned not to react to things that were designed to provoke reaction. I'm here because the territorial office sent me, he said, specifically because the complaint that came through the local land office had enough irregularities that my supervisor wanted an independent assessment. He paused. I was told Martin Frey had a history with Mr. Briggs. I was told to come here and find out what was actually happening. The silence held for another moment. Then, Maggie said carefully, you should probably know that what's actually happening is more organized than a simple land dispute. She turned to the last section of the document, the section she'd labeled simply as timeline, which showed the chronological relationship between the cattle removals, the filing of the household law complaint, and Briggs's land acquisitions in the county over the previous 18 months. She set it in front of Greer and let him read. He read it twice. When he looked up, his expression was still professionally neutral, but underneath it, something had sharpened. I'm going to need to speak with Emmett Cutler, he said again. Yes, she said. You will. Colton went to get Emmett while Greer organized his notes. She stayed in the front room and listened to Colton's boots cross the yard and tried to imagine what the next hour was going to look like. Emmett was 19 and probably not stupid and almost certainly scared, had been scared, she suspected, for a while, carrying around the weight of something he'd gotten into incrementally, the way people got into most things they later regretted. She'd been right that the face in the supply shed was guilt. She'd been right about most of it. Being right didn't make this part easy. When Colton came back, Emmett was with him, and the look on the young man's face when he saw Greer's documents spread across the table was enough to tell her that whatever story he'd been telling himself about what he was involved in had just collapsed. He was thin in the shoulders in the way of someone who hadn't fully finished growing, and he stood in the doorway of the front room and looked at the table and then at Colton, and his face did something complicated and young that she didn't look away from. Sit down, Emmett, Colton said. Emmett sat down. His hands were in his lap, and he was looking at the table rather than any of them. Greer introduced himself in the way of a man who had done this before, not unkindly, not gently either, just professionally. He explained what he was looking at and asked Emmett to tell him about his brother. What came out over the next 40 minutes was roughly what she'd expected and more than she'd hoped for. Wade had approached Emmett 8 months ago, not with the full picture. He'd told Emmett it was a business arrangement, that some of the Silver Hollow supply was being redirected through a secondary market, and that it was the kind of thing big operations did all the time, that nobody noticed and nobody got hurt, and Emmett could make some extra money. He'd presented it as ordinary, as something between brothers. Emmett had understood it was wrong. He hadn't understood it was part of something larger. He hadn't known about the land complaint, hadn't known about Briggs's acquisition strategy, hadn't known that the hay and the cattle and the supply numbers were being manipulated to create a picture that could be used against the man who'd given him work. He looked at Colton when he said that last part. Just once. Then he looked back at the table. Colton didn't say anything for a while. Then, "How much did Wade pay you?" Emmett told him. It was not a large amount, which somehow made it worse and better simultaneously. "Did you hide the invoice?" Greer asked. "Wade left it with me to keep safe. He said he called it insurance. I didn't know what that meant exactly." Emmett looked at his hands. "I should have asked more questions." "Yes," Colton said. Flat, not cruel. "You should have." Greer took a formal statement from Emmett. She wrote it out in her careful hand because Greer's was less legible, and Emmett signed it. And when it was done, Greer told Emmett not to leave the property and went to organize his findings. Emmett sat at the table after Greer left. Colton stayed. She started gathering the papers back into order. "I'm sorry," Emmett said. To the table. Then he looked up at Colton. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't—" "No," Colton said. "It doesn't." Another silence. "Are you going to let me go?" Emmett asked. Colton looked at him for a long time. She didn't look at either of them. She organized the papers and let the silence do what it needed to do. "Not tonight," Colton said finally. "Tonight you go to the bunkhouse. Tomorrow we figure out what comes next." He paused. "You talk to Wade before tomorrow, and I'll take it as a sign of where your loyalties actually are." Emmett nodded. He stood up and went out, and his footsteps across the porch were the footsteps of someone considerably older than 19. The front room was quiet. Colton stood at the window again. She'd started thinking of it as his window, the specific spot he occupied when he was working something through. "I should have seen it," he said. "You were looking outward," she said, "watching for the threat that comes at you from the front. This one came from inside." "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No," she said. "It's just true." He turned from the window. In the lamplight, he looked tired in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with the day's physical work. "What does Greer do now?" he asked. "He files with the territorial office. With our documentation and Emmett's statement, the complaint against you doesn't hold." She set the last paper down. "Briggs will know within a week that it didn't work." "And then?" "And then he either cuts his losses or escalates." She met Colton's eyes. "Based on everything I've seen, he's not a man who cuts his losses easily." He nodded slowly. "Neither am I." Greer stayed for 3 days. He was methodical and serious, and asked questions that were precise in a way she respected, because imprecise questions got imprecise answers, and imprecise answers were how investigations went wrong. She answered everything he asked and directed him to the documentation for everything she said, and by the end of the second day she understood that whatever else Greer was, he was not in Briggs's pocket. He was in the pocket of thoroughness, which was considerably more useful. On the evening of the second day, she overheard him tell Colton that the complaint against Silver Hollow was, in his professional judgment, retaliatory and without legitimate basis. He said it carefully, the way people said things they knew would be quoted. He said it in the front room with the door open, which she thought was intentional. On the morning of the third day, Greer packed his materials and shook Colton's hand in the yard and nodded at her from a distance with the particular respect of a man who had recognized competence and was acknowledging it in the limited way available to territorial assessors. Then he rode toward Millhaven, carrying 41 pages of her work toward the territorial capital. She watched him go from the porch. Colton came to stand beside her. They watched until the rider was out of sight, which took longer than expected because the road to Millhaven was flat and clear for nearly a mile. "It's not over," he said. "No," she agreed. "Briggs still has Frey. He still has whatever he's building on the northern edge." "Yes." "And 22 days from the original letter, the territorial household clock still runs." She turned to look at him. 8 days. 8 days, he confirmed. She had been aware of the clock the whole time, in the background of everything else. The ledger, the investigation, Greer's visit. The way you were aware of something running that you couldn't stop. 8 days. "We could file the documentation for the household arrangement before the deadline," she said carefully. "Make it formal." He looked at her. "The 2-week trial period ended 4 days ago," she said. "We haven't discussed it." "No," he said. "We haven't." The morning was still cool, that particular frontier coolness that burned off fast once the sun was properly up. Somewhere in the south pasture, Russ was saying something to Pete that involved a considerable amount of emphasis. "You don't have to," he started. I know, she said. This started as a practical arrangement. I know that too. He turned toward her. She looked at the horizon rather than at him, which was easier. I'm not good at this, he said. I know. I mean specifically, he said. I've been on my own a long time. I handle things by myself. I make decisions without checking. I go quiet when I should talk. I go to fences when I should stay at the table. She looked at him now. I know all of that, she said. I've been here 3 weeks. His jaw moved slightly. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement of the prospect. No, she said. But I'm still here. He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was doing something complicated to the angle of his face, and she was aware of her own pulse in a way she'd been trying not to be aware of for approximately a week. I'd like you to stay, he said. It came out rough, like something that had been waiting longer than 3 weeks to be said. Not because of the law, not because of the 30 days, because He stopped, started again. I come back to the kitchen in the morning knowing you're going to be there, and that stopped being a neutral fact. She was quiet. That's the best I can do right now, he said. I know it's not. It's enough, she said. He looked at her. It's enough, she said again, more clearly. I'm not asking for more than what's true, and what you just said is true. The tension in his shoulders shifted. Not fully. He was not a man who relaxed fully, and she was starting to understand that was just the shape of him, and the shape was not the problem she'd thought it might be. I'll file the documentation this week, she said, before the deadline. He nodded. And Colton. He looked at her. The arrangement has terms. Mine haven't changed. I need to be able to work. I need the accounts to be mine to manage. I need to be treated as, not as someone who ended up here because there was no better option. You weren't, he said. I could have found someone easier. She tilted her head slightly. You didn't want easier. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. He wasn't much of a smiler, but it was in the neighborhood. No, he said. I didn't. So, she filed the household documentation 4 days before the deadline, writing to Millhaven with Deke as witness, because Colton thought having her go alone was inadvisable, and she thought having him come along was inadvisable for different reasons. And Deke had been present from the beginning and could sign his name to the relevant section without it being a performance. The filing went through the territorial office address Greer had given her, bypassing Frey entirely. She included a copy of the 41 pages and a letter outlining the household arrangement in terms that were factual and precise and left no room for a legitimate challenge. She was back at Silver Hollow before sunset. Colton was waiting on the porch, which he wasn't doing, obviously, but the way he was positioned suggested he'd been out there for a while. Done? He asked. Done. He nodded. Dale Ackerman stopped by while you were gone. She came up the porch steps. What did he want? To let me know that Briggs has been making offers on 2 more properties on the northern edge. Both owners turned him down. A pause. He also said Briggs seems to know his Silver Hollow play didn't work. Apparently he's been less visible in town this week. He's reassessing, she said, or he's planning something different. Both, probably. She sat down on the porch steps, which she hadn't done before. She'd always gone inside, always had the next task waiting. The evening was cooling fast and the light was going amber along the fence line, and she realized, tired in a way that wasn't unpleasant, the kind of tired that came from finishing something. Colton sat down beside her. Not close, but not the careful distance of the first week either. Deke told me on the way back, she said, that you've been running Silver Hollow at about 60% of what it could be. Colton looked at the fence line. Deke talks a lot on supply runs, apparently. He talks to people who listen, she said. 60% because you've been doing 5 people's thinking while other people do the physical work. There's no system. Everything runs through you. That's how it's always worked. I know. And it's going to stop working when the next crisis hits. She picked up a small stone from the step and turned it in her fingers. I want to put a proper operations structure in place. Not complicated, just written down enough that things don't fall apart when one person is unavailable. He was quiet for a moment. You're already thinking about what comes next. I'm always thinking about what comes next, she said. I thought you'd gathered that by now. He looked at her sideways. That almost smile again. You said 60%, he said. What's 40%? Supply chain efficiency. Better purchasing contracts. I found a feed supplier in the next county that's 15% cheaper than your current one and has better quality control. A proper record system that doesn't stop when someone gets kicked by a horse. And, she paused, expansion of the North Pasture. You have the acreage for another herd section, but you're not using it because you haven't had the time to plan it properly. He turned to look at her directly. How long have you been thinking about this? Since day 4, approximately. She set the stone down. I didn't want to push before the other problems were resolved. He looked at the fence line again. The last light was going, the horizon turning the color of old copper. Wade Cutler, he said. Greer's report will name him. Yes, and Briggs. The connection is documented. Whether the territorial office pursues Briggs directly depends on whether they want to. She paused. He's influential. That kind of investigation takes time. I know. His voice was flat but not defeated. He's not going to stop. Probably not immediately. So we keep building. He said it like a decision, which she supposed it was. Yes, she said. We keep building. The porch went quiet. In the bunkhouse, she could hear Russ starting a story. The cadence was unmistakable. And Pete's shorter responses and even, distantly, Emmett's voice, which was a sound she wasn't entirely sure how to categorize. Emmett hadn't spoken to Wade since Greer's visit. She knew this because Deke knew it, and Deke told her things on supply runs, apparently. What do you want to do about Emmett? She asked. Colton was quiet for a long time. He's 19, he said, for the 3rd time since this started. And she understood now that this was not an excuse. It was Colton Voss working out, in the only way available to him, how mercy and accountability fit in the same room. He told the truth, she said, when it mattered. He should have told the truth before it mattered. Yes, she agreed. He should have. But he didn't, and then he did. She looked at the last edge of light. That's more than some people manage. Colton didn't respond, but she could feel the conversation landing somewhere. She stood up and brushed the dust off her skirt and looked down at him, still sitting on the porch steps in the cooling dark. I'm going to start the supply correspondence tonight, she said. The letter to the new feed supplier. I want to get the first order in before the month turns. He looked up at her. Against the evening light, his face was quieter than she'd seen it yet. Not soft, but something close to settled. Maggie, he said. She waited. I'm glad you were at the edge of town that morning, he said. It was not nothing. From Colton Voss, she was learning, the plain statements were the ones that cost something. So am I, she said, and meant it without qualification, which was its own kind of arrival. She went inside and lit the kitchen lamp and sat down at the table and opened the ledger to the next blank page. And outside on the porch, she could hear him sit there a while longer in the dark before he finally came in. And when he did, he went to the stove and put the kettle on without being asked, and neither of them mentioned it, and that was enough. That night, for the first time since she'd arrived at Silver Hollow Ranch, she didn't lie awake telling herself not to attach too much to small things. She just let them be what they were. The letter from the territorial capital arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Thomas Greer rode away from Silver Hollow with 41 pages of Maggie's work in his saddlebag. Colton brought it in from the road himself, which meant he'd been watching for it, which he would not have admitted to anyone, including himself. He set it on the kitchen table in front of Maggie without opening it, which told her something about where he was that morning. That particular combination of certainty and superstition that made practical men hand important things to someone else to open. She opened it. She read it once, quickly, for the overall verdict. Then she read it again slowly, for the details. Then she set it flat on the table and looked at Colton. The complaint against Silver Hollow has been dismissed, she said. The territorial office found it to be without legitimate basis and notes that the evidence submitted in response suggests the complaint itself may have been filed in bad faith. She paused. They're opening a separate inquiry into Martin Frey's handling of land assessments over the previous 2 years. Colton looked at the letter. He didn't reach for it immediately. Briggs? He asked. Not named directly, but the inquiry into Frey will uncover the assessment payments, and those lead back to Briggs. She turned the letter slightly toward him. It's not over for him. It's just beginning. He picked up the letter and read it himself slowly, in the way of a man who was used to checking what he'd been told against the original source. She didn't take it personally. She understood it was not distrust of her specifically, but a general policy of verification that had kept him alive and solvent for 8 years, in a territory where bad information was its own kind of weather. When he set it down, his expression was the one she'd seen when he was trying to feel something and wasn't sure he was allowed to yet. "It's done," she said simply. "Part of it," he said. "The part that threatened your land," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "Our land." She held his gaze for a moment. The word landed with a weight that the practical paperwork they'd filed, the household documentation, the formal arrangement, hadn't quite carried by itself. Documentation was documentation. That word, the way he said it, was something else. "Our land," she agreed. Outside, Dake was crossing the yard with the particular unhurried stride of a man who had outlasted enough crises to know that a good morning was worth taking at the pace it offered. Through the window, she could see Russ already talking, moving his hands, telling something to Pete, who was half listening the way Pete always half listened to Russ, and somehow retained everything anyway. The ranch looked the same as it had every other morning. That was the thing about land. It didn't celebrate with you. It just kept being what it was and waited to see if you'd keep showing up. She thought that was probably right, actually. Probably the way it should be. Emmett came to find Colton that afternoon. She knew it was coming because Deke had mentioned, in the indirect way Deke mentioned things, that the boy had been quieter than usual all morning, and that quieter than usual for Emmett meant something was working itself up to the surface. She was at the kitchen table when it happened, close enough to the open window to hear the conversation in the yard without meaning to, which had become something of a recurring condition at Silver Hollow. "I talked to Wade last night," Emmett said. A pause. Colton's voice. "I told you not to." "I know." Emmett's voice was steady in the particular way of someone who had rehearsed a steadiness they didn't entirely feel. "I needed to tell him I was done, that I'd signed a statement, and that whatever he and Briggs worked out next, I wasn't part of it." Another pause. "How'd he take it?" Colton asked. "He was angry." A beat. "He's always angry when something doesn't go his way. I used to think that was how things worked. If someone's angry enough, they must be right." Another beat, longer. "I don't think that anymore." The yard went quiet long enough that she thought the conversation had ended. Then Colton said, "You staying or going?" Emmett took a moment. "That's up to you." "I asked what you wanted." "I want to stay," Emmett said. It came out simpler than the rest, less rehearsed. "I know I don't have the right to want that." "No," Colton said. "You don't, but you've got it anyway, for now." A pause. "You'll work the North Pasture expansion for the next 6 months. Hard work, longer hours. You'll be paid regular wages. If you do something like this again, anything like this, you're gone, and I'll make sure the next ranch you try to work at knows why." "Understood," Emmett said. "And you're going to apologize to Maggie." A silence. "She's the one who found it. She's the one who let you stay employed while she found it," Colton said. "There's a difference." She moved away from the window before she heard Emmett's response, because listening further felt like taking something that wasn't hers. But that evening, when Emmett came to the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and said, in the flat, honest way of someone not dressing anything up, "I'm sorry for what I put you through," she accepted it in the same spirit. "Don't do it again," she said. "No, ma'am." She went back to the supply correspondence, and he went to the bunkhouse. And that was the end of it, or the beginning of whatever came next for a 19-year-old who had chosen one direction and then chosen another. She thought about that sometimes, about how many of the worst things people did came not from cruelty, but from the particular blindness of wanting to belong to someone who didn't deserve the belonging. Wade had been Emmett's older brother and his family and his authority, all in one person. That kind of influence didn't require malice to cause damage. It just required presence. She understood that more than she liked to admit. The North Pasture expansion started in earnest 3 weeks after the territorial letter arrived. She'd drawn up the supply plan and the purchasing schedule and the projected costs, which she presented to Colton at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with the same methodical calm she'd brought to the ledger reconciliation back in week 1. He went through it with the focused attention of a man who had learned that her documents said what they said and didn't require defensive reading. "This feed supplier," he said, pointing at the purchasing column, "you went with the new one. 15% lower, and the first delivery was on time and the quality was consistent," she said. I checked against the old supplier's last 6 deliveries. There's no comparison. He nodded. This estimate for the fencing materials. Based on the quote Deke got last week, I've asked him to get a second quote before we commit. He looked at her. When did you ask Deke to do that? Yesterday morning. She paused. Was that wrong? No, he said. I usually run the supply decisions through myself. You were in the South Pasture when the question came up and Deke was available and it needed to be asked this week to have the answer in time for the order. She met his eyes. I can loop you in on smaller decisions if you prefer. I just didn't want the timeline to slip. He was quiet for a moment. Not the angry quiet, the processing quiet. She'd become fluent in the difference. It's fine, he said. Colton. He looked at her. We're going to have this conversation a few more times. You've run everything through yourself for 8 years. That's not going to change overnight. She turned a page. I'm not trying to take the decisions away from you. I'm trying to make sure things don't fall through the gap between your attention and mine. He looked at the document. How do we know where the gap is? We keep telling each other what we're doing, she said, even when it feels like extra effort. He seemed to consider that in the particular way he considered things that were true but inconvenient. That's going to be harder for me than the fencing, he said. I know, she said. Do it anyway. His jaw did the thing it did when he was amused but not going to admit it. They went through the rest of the document, and she noticed, not for the first time but with more clarity than before, that the questions he asked had shifted over the weeks. In the beginning, he'd asked questions that were essentially tests, checking whether she knew what she was talking about, whether the numbers were real, whether she'd thought past the obvious. Now he asked questions that were genuine, things he wanted to understand, things where her answer would change how he moved. The distinction mattered more than she had words for. Harlan Briggs made his last move in late November. She'd expected something. A man who had spent 18 months building a strategy didn't simply absorb a territorial rebuke and go home to reconsider his priorities. Briggs was 60-something, wealthy, accustomed to getting what he wanted through patience and pressure, and she had understood from the beginning that the Greer report would not end him. It would only redirect him. What she hadn't anticipated was the particular form it took. A piece in the county weekly newspaper, a letter to the editor, attributed to a concerned citizen who declined to be named, questioning the legitimacy of the Silver Hollow household arrangement. It did not use Colton's name. It did not use hers. It used terms like recently established households and arrangements of convenience and the territorial standard for genuine domestic partnership in ways that anyone who'd been paying attention in Mill Haven would understand immediately. It was in its way precisely crafted, too indirect to be legally actionable, specific enough to be understood. A piece of social pressure designed to do what the formal legal approach had failed to do, make people talk, make the talk reach the territorial office's ear, make someone ask whether the household documentation was genuine or convenient. She read it on the porch on a Thursday morning, in the copy of the weekly that Deke brought back from the supply run. She read it twice. Then she folded it in half and went inside and made coffee and thought about what kind of response made sense and what kind of response felt good but would cost more than it was worth. Colton found the folded paper on the table when he came in for his mid-morning coffee. He picked it up, read it, and set it back down. Briggs, he said, almost certainly. Can we prove it? Probably not directly. Probably not quickly. She turned her cup in her hands. This isn't a legal move, it's a social one. He looked at her. Meaning? Meaning he can't touch the land anymore. Greer closed that door. So he's trying the next thing available to him, which is reputation. She paused. Specifically mine. The word hung in the kitchen for a moment. What do you want to do? He asked. She appreciated that he asked. She'd noticed he did that more now, asked before deciding, which was a shift from the man who had ridden slightly ahead on the road from Mill Haven and made directional choices without consultation. I want to go to town, she said. He nodded. When? Saturday. Market day. I'll come with you. I know, she said. Market day in Mill Haven in late November was cold enough that people moved faster than usual between the stalls and the heated interiors, which compressed the social landscape in ways that she found useful. Less space between people meant conversations happened more easily, and conversations were what Saturday was for. She wore her better dress, which was only better in the relative sense, and she did her hair in a slightly less utilitarian arrangement than her usual. And she was aware of both of these decisions and made them deliberately without apologizing to herself for them. There were people who believed that not caring about appearance was a form of strength. She had found it was usually a form of not having thought carefully about what appearance communicated. Colton noticed. He didn't say anything, which was appropriate, but she caught the particular quality of attention that meant he'd registered the difference. They went to the general store first. Vera Alderman was there, because Vera Alderman was always at the general store on Saturday morning. She looked at them when they came in with the particular alert expression of someone who had read the letter in the weekly and was now processing the live version of the people it had discussed without naming. Maggie went directly to her. "Vera," she said, "how are you?" Vera blinked. "I'm fine. I didn't expect—" "I wanted to ask," Maggie said pleasantly, "whether you'd seen the county weekly this week." Vera's expression did something careful. "I may have glanced at it." "The letter to the editor." Maggie kept her voice conversational, the tone of someone discussing something mildly interesting rather than personally concerned. "I thought it was a good example of how someone with an agenda can frame a question without actually asking it. Very clever, technically." She tilted her head slightly. "Don't you think?" Vera didn't know where to put her eyes. "I wouldn't know," Vera said. "I don't know who wrote it." "No," Maggie said. "Neither do I, officially." She let that sit for just a moment. "I thought you should know, since you've been curious about how things are going at Silver Hollow, that we've had a productive fall. The North Pasture expansion is underway. Our supply accounts are in better order than they've been in years, and the Territorial Office has closed its inquiry into our land claim entirely." She smiled, and she meant it, because she'd earned the right to mean it. "But thank you for your interest. It's kind of you to keep up." She moved away to look at the dry goods. Colton appeared beside her 2 minutes later, ostensibly examining a display of rope that he did not need. "That was something," he said quietly. "I was perfectly pleasant," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what made it something." She picked up a spool of thread she actually needed and took it to the counter. What? The more important conversation happened at the post office. Martin Frey was there, not because he'd known they would be, she suspected, but because it was Saturday, and Frey was a man whose habits were predictable. He ran the local land office out of the back of the post office building, and he was coming through the front when they arrived, and he stopped when he saw them with the startled quality of a man who had convinced himself he was managing a situation and was now confronting evidence that the situation had other opinions. Colton stopped in front of him. Frey was shorter than Colton by several inches, and aware of it in the specific way of men who had spent their professional lives compensating for the fact. He had a carefully maintained appearance, mustache, pressed coat, that was the surface of a man who needed to look authoritative because actual authority had never quite settled on him naturally. "Mr. Voss," he said. His voice was steady. She credited him that. "Frey." Colton didn't extend his hand, which was as clear a statement as a man like Colton could make without speaking. "You've been managing the land assessment records for the county for what, 6 years?" Frey's expression tightened. Seven. Colton nodded slowly. "Long time to keep records." "It is," Frey said. "Records that go back to the territorial capital eventually," Colton said. "One way or another." A silence. Frey looked at Maggie. Not dismissively, she noted, but with something closer to wariness, which told her he'd read Greer's report and understood who had compiled the 41 pages. "I've cooperated fully with the territorial inquiry," Frey said. "I heard," Colton said. "I imagine that's a complicated thing to fully cooperate with when you've spent 7 years accepting assessment fees from a man whose complaint you were supposed to evaluate independently." Frey's face went through several expressions quickly. "I'm not accusing you of anything today," Colton said. The flatness of his voice made it more effective than anger would have. "I'm just noting that 7 years is a long time to keep records, and records tell stories whether the people in them want them to or not." He held Frey's gaze for another moment. "Enjoy your Saturday." He walked past him into the post office. Frey stood there for a second and then moved away quickly, with the walk of a man who needed to be somewhere else immediately. Maggie collected their mail. 2 letters, one from the territorial capital that was almost certainly administrative follow-up from Greer's report, one she didn't recognize, and came back to where Colton was waiting. "How was that?" she asked. "Necessary," he said. "Not overdone?" He thought about it honestly, which she liked. "No," he said. "About right." She handed him the territorial letter and kept the other one, which turned out to be from Dale Ackerman. A brief, straightforward note saying he'd heard the complaint had been dismissed, and that if Colton ever wanted to discuss a cooperative arrangement for the shared water rights long term, he was open to it. She read it twice and handed it to Colton. He read it and folded it into his coat pocket. "That's a different conversation than the one we had in October," he said. "People recalibrate," she said, "when they see who's still standing." What? The winter came hard. It came the way the frontier announced most things, without much warning and without much patience for people who hadn't prepared for it. The first real storm arrived in December, the kind that started quiet and became serious overnight, temperature dropping faster than the thermometer seemed to want to register. Wind coming out of the northwest with the particular hostility of wind that has traveled a long way and isn't interested in being blocked. She'd been watching the sky since noon and had said, at supper, that she thought they had until morning, but not much longer. Colton had agreed. He'd spent the afternoon making sure the herd was in the near pastures, and the supply situation was covered, and the bunkhouse had enough wood for 3 days. What he hadn't accounted for, what neither of them had, was that one section of the north pasture fence had a weak post she hadn't gotten to yet in the expansion records, and by midnight 30 head of cattle had pushed through it into the open territory north of the property line. Deke found out when he did his midnight check. He came to the main house and knocked, which was something Deke had never done before in Colton's recollection. She heard the knock. She heard Colton's door, his boots, the conversation in the hallway. She was already dressed before Deke finished explaining, because she'd been half listening to the storm and half sleeping, and the knock had pulled her immediately to the surface. She came out of her room to find Colton in his coat with the particular set of his jaw that she'd learned meant he'd already decided what he was going to do. "No," she said. He looked at her. "Not alone," she said. "It's midnight and it's a blizzard," he said. "Deke and I can—" "Deke's knee has been bad since Tuesday," she said. "He told me when I asked why he was walking differently. He didn't want to tell you because you'd take him off the fence work." She looked at Deke, who had the expression of a man who had been accurately described and was weighing whether to be grateful or annoyed. "How bad is it tonight?" Deke was quiet for a moment. "I can ride," he said. "I can't guarantee I can do much when I get there." She turned back to Colton. "3 of us," she said. "I'll take the east side, you take the north. Deke manages the main gate and brings any cattle that double back." Colton looked at her in the specific way he looked at things he was about to argue with, and then didn't. "You've never done a night roundup," he said. "No," she said. "But I know how the north pasture is laid out. I know where the gaps in the fence are because I've been mapping the expansion, and I know how to stay on a horse in difficult conditions." She met his eyes. "I also know that if you go alone and something goes wrong, I'm in this house alone in a blizzard, and you are somewhere in a north pasture in December." That landed. "You know how much I don't want that to be the reason you let me come," she said. "So let it be a reason, and we'll go." He grabbed her an extra coat from the hook by the door without comment. It was his, and too large, and she put it on without discussing it. They rode out into the dark and the cold and the horizontal snow that turned the world into 20 feet of visibility, and everything beyond that into white noise. It was the hardest 2 hours she'd spent since arriving at Silver Hollow. The cold was a different category of cold than she'd experienced in Pennsylvania, drier and more complete. The kind that found the gaps in clothing with the single-minded efficiency of something with a purpose. She could feel her face going wrong within the first 20 minutes, the skin tightening past discomfort into something that required active monitoring. She stayed on the east line and worked it methodically, the way she worked everything, section by section, accounting for what she could see and noting where the visibility fell off. She found 8 cattle in the first 40 minutes, which meant they'd drifted east rather than north, and she pushed them back toward the gap in the fence and through it and came back for the next section. The horse was better than she was in the conditions. She let it have more decision-making than she normally would have, and it seemed to understand what was needed, which was one of the useful things about horses that she'd been learning since she arrived. She found the last stray, a younger animal, panicked, moving in circles near the north fence line, where it had somehow gotten itself separated from the drift, around the 90-minute mark. Getting it turned around and moving south took longer than it should have because the animal was cold and scared and not inclined to trust her, which felt like a metaphor she wasn't going to examine too closely at midnight in a blizzard. When she finally pushed it through the gate and came back into the yard, Deke was there with a lamp that was barely surviving the wind, and 3 of the cattle she'd brought back were already in the near pasture, and there was no sign of Colton. "Where is he?" she asked. Deke looked at the north pasture. "Rode north about an hour ago. Said there were more up there." She looked at the darkness north of the fence line. "How long ago?" "Maybe 40 minutes since I saw him last." She turned her horse north. "Maggie," Deke said. "He'll come back." "I know," she said. "But 40 minutes is 40 minutes." She rode through the gap in the fence and into the open territory north of Silver Hollow, where the wind was worse because there was nothing to interrupt it, and called Colton's name into the dark, which felt, in the moment, like exactly the kind of thing she would have made fun of 2 months ago. She found him 20 minutes north. He'd gotten the remaining cattle moving south, 6 of them, which was the bulk of what had gone through the fence, and was behind them, pushing them, and he was moving more slowly than the cattle, and she understood immediately what that meant. She came alongside him. His face, in the darkness, was wrong, in the way faces went wrong when cold had been working on them for too long. He was functional, upright, moving, but the margin was getting thin. "Colton." "I've got them moving," he said. His voice was thick. "I know. Let them go." Deke's at the gate. She pulled her horse alongside his. "Look at me." He looked at her. His eyes were present, which was the important thing. "You're too cold," she said. "I'm fine." "You're too cold," she said again. "The cattle are going south on their own now. They know where the gate is. We need to go south too, and we need to go now." He looked at the cattle moving away from them. She thought about what he would do if she were the one sitting on a horse 40 minutes north of the property line in December, function compromised, arguing about whether she was fine. She thought she knew. "Colton," she said, "I'm asking you to come with me." He looked at her. It was the asking, she thought later, that moved him, not the logic, not the urgency. The asking. "Okay," he said. They rode south. She got him inside and out of the coat and near the stove in that order, and Deke appeared at the door long enough to confirm all 30 head were accounted for, and the gap in the fence had been temporarily patched with materials from the supply shed, and the storm was beginning to ease, and she thanked him, and he went back to the bunkhouse, and she turned back to Colton. He was sitting in the chair nearest the stove and looking better than he had 20 minutes north, which wasn't the same as looking good. She made the coffee strong and hot and put it in his hands and sat across from him. "Your face is coming back," she said. He touched his cheek with one hand. "Feels like it." "Does anything feel wrong? Fingers?" "Fine." He flexed them to demonstrate. "I wasn't out there as long as it probably looked." "You were out there long enough," she said. He looked at her. In the stove light, with his color slowly returning, he looked like himself again, or the version of himself she'd come to know, which she was beginning to think was more herself than the version he'd been before she arrived. "You came after me," he said. "Yes." "I told you I was fine." "You tell a fence post you're fine," she said. "It doesn't make you fine." The corner of his mouth moved. "Thank you," he said. Not the thank you of obligation, the other kind, the one that required something to give. She held her coffee cup and looked at the stove. "Colton," she said, "I need to say something and I need you to let me finish before you respond." He waited. "You have spent your whole life making yourself the load-bearing wall," she said. "The thing everything else rests against. And I understand why. This land, this operation, the people who work here, they needed someone to hold. You were that person and you held. And it's the reason Silver Hollow is still standing." She looked at him. "But load-bearing walls don't have to do it alone," she said. "That's what the rest of the structure is for. You can want help and still be the man who built this. They're not the same thing, and they never were." She paused. "I'm not asking you to be a different person. I'm asking you to stop treating the asking as a failure." He was looking at her with the particular focused attention he gave to things that required it. "I rode north tonight," he said slowly, "because I thought if I could get all of them back, I wouldn't have to tell you that the fence section I should have caught was the one that gave way." She looked at him. "Colton, I mapped that fence. I knew the week post was there. I was going to get to it in the week's schedule. She held his gaze. It wasn't yours to catch alone. He was quiet. That's the thing, she said. When it's shared, the failure is shared too. That's not weakness. That's just how it works. When two people are actually doing this together. The storm outside had dropped to a murmur. The stove clicked and settled. I'm not good at this, he said. The same thing he'd said on the porch 3 weeks ago. You said that before, she said. It was true then. It's less true now, she said. You came south when I asked. You didn't fight me for 20 minutes about being fine. A month ago you would have. He looked at his coffee. I'm paying attention, he said. It's slow. I know, she said. I'm not going anywhere. He looked up at her then, and the look on his face was the most unguarded thing she'd seen from him in 7 weeks. Not soft exactly, because he didn't do soft, but open in the way of a door that had been closed a long time and was testing the hinges. I know you're not, he said. They married on the first clear day in January. Not a large event that hadn't been discussed and wouldn't have been wanted by either of them. Deke and Pete as witnesses, Mrs. Hutchins, who rode out from Millhaven because Maggie had written her and she would not have stayed away on principle. Dale Ackerman appeared uninvited but was welcome because he'd brought a bottle of something appropriate to the occasion, and his presence was, in its way, a statement about which side of the Briggs situation the neighboring ranchers had landed on. The territorial documentation had already been filed, already confirmed, already processed. The ceremony was not for the law, it was for them. The particular human need to mark a thing that has already become true, to say it out loud in front of people who would remember. Colton was not a man built for ceremonies, and the ceremony was short. What she remembered from it afterward was not the words, but the moment just before, standing next to him in the front room of the main house they'd spent 2 months reorganizing and arguing in and building something inside of, and feeling, with a clarity that had nothing sentimental about it, that she was exactly where she had made herself be, not where circumstance had put her, where she had chosen, step by step, with every difficult conversation and every ledger page and every midnight ride north through a blizzard, to stand. He held her hand during the words, and his grip was not gentle exactly, but it was certain, and she thought that was probably the most accurate description of the man, not gentle, but certain. And it had been enough from the beginning, she understood now, because certainty was its own kind of warmth, if you let it be. In February, the territorial inquiry into Martin Frey's assessment practices concluded with a formal censure and the suspension of his authority to process land claims independently. 3 of the assessments he'd handled, the ones with direct financial relationships to Harlan Briggs, were voided and referred to the territorial court for further review. Briggs hired a lawyer from the Capitol. The lawyer filed motions. The motions moved through the court system with the particular velocity of things that were probably going to resolve eventually, but weren't in any hurry. Briggs did not attempt another move against Silver Hollow. She thought he'd understood, finally, that the calculus had changed. A year ago, he'd been maneuvering against a rancher who didn't know he was being maneuvered against. Now the rancher knew, the territorial office knew, the neighboring properties knew, and the woman who had documented all of it was still on the property and still had the ledgers. The cost-benefit had shifted, that was all. Men like Briggs understood cost-benefit in the way they didn't always understand other things. She didn't celebrate this. She noted it and watched the horizon and kept the records current, because a man who understood cost-benefit would recalculate if the cost changed. But for now, the horizon was clear. Spring came the way it came in that part of the territory, fast and without transition, as if the land had decided it was done with winter and moved on with the particular efficiency she'd come to associate with the frontier generally. Things either worked out here or they didn't. The middle ground was smaller than back east. The north pasture expansion was complete by April. She rode through it on a Wednesday morning with Colton and looked at the fence line that was now solid, properly posted, properly strung, with no sections that would give way in a December storm, and the new grazing sections that would carry additional head by fall, and ran the numbers in her head the way she did automatically now, the way she'd always done arithmetic against the physical world, checking projected against actual. 60%, she said. Colton looked at her. You were running at 60%, she said. That's what Deke told me on the supply run back in October. She looked at the fence line. We're at 75 now, by fall, closer to 85. And the other 15? Feed efficiency, she said. I want to renegotiate the contract with the new supplier in June when the season changes. And there's a water management issue on the south end that we haven't addressed yet. The drainage during heavy rain is inefficient, and it's affecting the quality of the grazing section down there. He was quiet for a moment. You're going to keep doing this, he said. The whole time. Finding the 15%. That's the job, she said. I thought the job was the accounts. The accounts are the record of the job, she said. The job is the ranch. He looked at her with the particular expression that had replaced the assessment look, the one that wasn't checking her against a standard anymore, but seeing something he'd already decided the value of. Okay, he said. Okay? Okay, he said again, simply. She turned her horse back toward the main house and he rode beside her, which was different from the first ride 8 months ago, when he'd been slightly ahead the way a man who made decisions without consulting anyone was slightly ahead. Now he rode at the same pace, the same line, and it wasn't a small thing. Nothing was small, really, if you were paying attention. Deke turned 60 that spring and they gave him a party, which he claimed not to want and attended with unconcealed satisfaction. Russ told 4 stories, only 2 of which were true by anyone's estimation. And Pete ate more than anyone expected, and Emmett, who had worked the North Pasture expansion through the winter without complaint, and with a quality of focused effort that looked, if you watched it closely, like someone working off a debt they couldn't settle any other way, brought Deke a pocket knife with a carved handle that he'd ordered from a catalog 3 months ago and clearly been thinking about since. Deke looked at it for a moment and said thank you in the way of a man who didn't have more than that available and knew the other person understood. She watched all of this from the kitchen doorway and thought about what a strange and specific thing it was, to have arrived at a place not knowing it would become a place worth arriving at. She'd come to Silver Hollow because the options had narrowed and the calculus had pointed here, and that was true and real and she didn't need to dress it up. But it had become something the calculus hadn't predicted, in the way that most worth-having things didn't come from prediction. She'd thought, sitting in Mrs. Hutchins' kitchen 8 months ago, that she was making a practical decision. And she had been. The practicality was real, and she didn't apologize for it, and she didn't think Colton did either. But practical decisions, made by people who pay close attention and tell each other what they're doing and ride north in blizzards when the other one needs finding, those decisions could become something else. Not instead of what they were. On top of it, like a second story on a solid foundation. She thought that was probably the truest thing she'd learned out here, in the territory that had no patience for half measures, that the things built from necessity and the things built from choice weren't always as different as people wanted them to be. Sometimes the necessity just showed you where to start. Colton came to stand beside her in the doorway and looked at the party happening in the yard. Russ on his 5th story, Emmett pretending not to listen, Deke holding the pocket knife with both hands like something fragile, and was quiet for a moment. He's going to talk about that party for 2 years, Colton said. At least, she said, Russ is going to be part of the story by the time he's done with it. Russ is already part of the story, she said. He's told 3 versions of it in the last hour. Colton looked at her sideways. That almost smile, which she'd come to understand was what full satisfaction looked like on his face. Maggie, he said. I want to put your name on the deed. She was quiet for a moment. The party continued in the yard, and the spring evening was coming down gold, and the horses in the near pasture were doing what horses did in good weather, which was move slowly and make the most of it. That's a big thing, she said. I know. It's not necessary legally. I know that too. She looked at the yard and the people in it, and the fence line beyond, and the north pasture that was now properly expanded and properly fenced and properly managed. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay, she said. The same word he'd given her on the ride through the north pasture returned with the same plainness. This was how they said the important things, she'd found. Without ceremony, without dramatics, in the in-between moments that turned out not to be in-between at all, but the thing itself. He nodded once. They stood in the doorway of the main house of Silver Hollow Ranch and watched the people on their land in the spring evening, and she thought about a woman who had walked into 4 offices and watched the same expression cross 4 different men's faces, and about a territorial law and an oily smile and a letter on a Tuesday, and about 41 pages of her own work and a midnight ride through December and the particular feel of a door that has been closed a long time testing its hinges. She thought about what she would tell herself. If she could send a message back to the person who had sat in Mrs. Hutchins' boarding house with a ledger and a pencil behind her ear, deciding whether to be at the edge of town before sunrise. She thought she'd say this: "The people who assume you won't last are doing you a favor. They've already decided the outcome, which means they've stopped watching carefully. And the ones who stop watching carefully are always the last to see what's actually being built. Be at the edge of town before sunrise. Take the reins. Do the work that needs doing, not the work that will impress anyone, and know the difference. And when someone rides north into a blizzard because they can't quite let themselves ask for help yet, go after them. Not because they can't manage, because they shouldn't have to manage alone. There's a difference, and it matters, and it's worth riding out into December to make it clear." The evening settled. The party continued. Russ started what was probably his sixth story, and Emmett actually laughed this time, which was something she hadn't heard before, and it was an ordinary laugh, uncomplicated. The laugh of someone who had found their way back to a version of themselves that didn't carry the weight they'd been carrying. Colton shifted beside her, not moving away. The land was theirs, the work was theirs, the name would be on the deed, and the woman everyone had watched arrive in a frontier town with a small trunk and a pencil behind her ear. The woman they'd expected to fail, expected to leave, expected to be exactly what their assumptions had already made her, was standing in the doorway of her own home, in the evening light, watching the life she'd built with her own clear eyes, and finding that it was enough. That it was, in fact, more than enough. That it was exactly what she'd been working toward without knowing it, since long before a Tuesday letter and a boarding house kitchen and a rancher who sat down across from her without being invited and actually looked at the ledger. Some people need a crisis to become who they were always going to be. She had needed a ledger, a loose board, a December blizzard, and a stubborn man who learned, slowly and imperfectly, that the strongest thing he ever did was stop carrying everything alone. Silver Hollow Ranch stood, as it would continue to stand, in the territory that asked more of people than they thought they had. It turned out they had more than they thought. Most people do, if someone's paying attention,